Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Matthew Bartko, regular panelists Mario Ramos y Reyes and Christy Yao. Of course, today we have a very special guest, Joshua Perkins, the third of our interviewees. And mind you, this order 1, 2, 3 has no bearing on anything other than, well, we have to arrange some order. We'll begin, as we always do, in prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Let us pray, Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. And Matthew, you're going to put us through our paces.
My pleasure. Joshua, if we could start with a brief introduction. If you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what brought you to the point of the Solidarity Party and running for president under its banner.
Certainly. So I grew up in Houston, Texas. I grew up in a suburb slightly outside the city. I was homeschooled by my mother for 13 years, so I never actually stepped foot inside of a school classroom until I took the PSAT my junior year. It's a mixed-race family. My father has Filipino heritage as well as Black heritage, Japanese, a couple of other ethnicities, and my mother was adopted, actually, so we're not quite sure, but she appears to be white of European heritage. I grew up with two siblings, an older brother and a younger brother. We had fun, squabbles, etc. I managed to get into Rice University, attended there, graduated with a degree in philosophy, and got a job at a company for about half a year, and then decided I wanted to become an actuary and got into that field, and I've been working at an actuarial role at a life insurance company for the past just about 10 years now. I have lived in Houston all my life. As I said, was born here, grew up here, attended Rice University here, and then settled here for my job. So it's home to me. I haven't known anywhere else. It's a great city, by the way, if anyone's interested in coming here. It's really, people are great. There's lots of stuff to do. I grew up fairly conservative, I suppose, my upbringing politically. My parents and I attended a non-denominational church growing up. It was probably fairly standard politically, what you'd think of, Republican, pro-life, conservative type stuff. Supported Reagan, Bush, weren't big fans of Clinton, and then George W. when he came along, obviously. As I grew up and in my high school years, I became more libertarian-minded, read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. I took a economics class through a co-op, which was fairly libertarian in its outlook. And then in college, I continued down that path, did a lot of reading, spoke with people on that sort of thing, and voted for Ron Paul in my first election where I was able to vote, I believe, in I guess I probably voted for Bush in 2004, which was my first time voting. But then 2008, I voted for Ron Paul, even though he was not on the ballot for the general election. I wrote him in instead of McCain and Palin. But as I grew up, more matured out of college, and I began to see the ways in which libertarianism, while it is, it has the benefit of being simple in a sense, in that you can boil everything down to the principle of self-ownership, principle of non-aggression, and everything else flows from that. I began to see the ways in which that works out in practice are harmful to people, and that the reason that we moved away from what was a more libertarian state in many senses in the 18th century, or the 19th century and early 20th century, toward a less libertarian, more social welfare, was that the libertarian state wasn't really working very well for especially the least of these, for the poor and the vulnerable among us. People were more likely to starve to death, or to have malnutrition, or to die of illnesses that could have been treated if they had the funds to pay for such treatment. And I wasn't convinced anymore that charity would be sufficient, which is the main argument I heard and had actually made myself, that if the government just stopped interfering with churches and other charities, that then they would be able to provide for all of the needy people. But I just don't think that's really realistic. I think there's a bit of a naivete and idealism about libertarianism now that I look back on it. And so I moved away from that between 2008 and 2012. At that point, I was probably fairly close to where I am now, fairly moderate. I still was. I had never voted for a Democrat. The abortion issue was always the most important one to me, and still is. And so I just couldn't stomach casting my ballot for someone who would support the right of people to terminate other people's lives. So in 2012, instead of voting for Mitt Romney, I was not a big fan of him, especially after his infamous 47% comment, where he said, people who don't pay income taxes are always going to vote for the Democrats. Similar, I think, in many respects to Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables comment 4 years later, where she, sort of alienated a lot of people just based on an offhand comment that probably shouldn't have been said if she had been thinking about it. So I ended up writing in the most moderate Republican of the candidates at the time, which I believe was John Huntsman Jr. And then, fortunately, before the 2016 election, I found the American Solidarity Party in April of 2015, actually, signed up, and was very glad to be able to vote for Maturin Munoz's ticket in 2016. And I'm definitely looking forward to doing the same in 2020, whether it's me, Joe Schreiner, or Brian Carroll on the ballot. I'll be happy to cast my vote for the Solidarity Party's candidate.
Now, this is something I hope you can explain relatively quickly, but for anyone who doesn't know, what is an actuary?
Certainly. That is a question that I get about probably 80% of the time when I when I tell people what I do. So an actuary is broadly, it's someone who assesses financial and economic risk from a statistical perspective. So the main role that we see actuaries play that affects just about everyone is that we set insurance premiums of all sorts. So your life insurance premiums, car insurance, health insurance, homeowners insurance, pretty much anything that's insurance, we set the premiums for that based on risk factors and the factors of the individual, perhaps where they live potentially, for homes and for vehicles, the properties or the characteristics of the how old your vehicle is, any safety features. Same with the home, burglar alarms and such. And so we also actuaries also do a lot for the Social Security Administration. So if you see reports issued by the chief actuary for the Social Security Administration regarding the solvency or predicted solvency of the fund over the next several decades, that's what he does.
So that you're not a plenipotentiary.
No.
All right. I'm glad to hear that.
So, Josh, I want to make sure I address what's probably the biggest issue on a lot of Solidarity Party members' minds when they're thinking of who to vote for on their ballot. If, God willing, you should actually win the presidency, how are you going to address the abortion issue? In particular, address the abolishment of abortion in America?
I think that perhaps the best way, practically speaking, let me just first state that I believe that abortion is intrinsically wrong in all cases. The direct taking, an intentional taking of another human's life is always wrong. I mean, we can talk about people who have committed murder in as a separate case, but people who have not done anything to deserve, or that would be considered to have to deserve such violence against them, it's always wrong. And I understand that practically, though, there are exceptions to be made for the most common ones, of course, are for rape, incest, and the life of the mother. And I think that if we're going to talk about getting things done, which I think is the point of one of the things I appreciate about this party is that we talk about common sense. We're not, as many libertarians are, ideologically focused to the point of obsession on our principles, and anything that even hints at compromising those principles, we just dismiss out of hand. That's not us. That's we're interested in solutions that work toward the common good, not necessarily achieving everything we want at one time, but doing what we can to make things better. So in that regard, I think that the proposal that Charles Camacy made in his book, Beyond the Abortion Wars, which I unfortunately have not gotten to finish since my wife took it first and read it. But she told me about it. And she mentioned that he talks about basically a compromise between the left and the right, where the left accepts abortion restrictions, significant abortion restrictions, so as to decrease the abortion rate drastically. And the right accepts provisions, supports and protections and provisions for mothers in need and for their unborn children, and then also for those children and the mothers after birth as well. So that would include things like maternity leave, parental leave, job protections for pregnant women, obviously financial and social support for women in crisis pregnancies, living allowances potentially, obviously medical care, again, for the mothers and their children. And so I think that sort of thing is the only way we could, at this point in time, see a realistic chance of changing the culture in our nation. So I think if we can do that sort of thing, we could get that implemented, then we would have the chance to change hearts as well. If we see that the abortion rate drops significantly, but mothers are still protected and cared for, that outlawing abortion or prohibiting it, restricting it greatly, does not result in the all the negative things that the people on the left side of this issue decry and worry about, back alleys, coat hangers, things like that. But then hopefully the people on the right will also see that, these additional taxes or additional funds going toward these social services don't result in communism or socialism or whatever it is that they're worried about on their side. So I think that would be the most realistic way to end this struggle that we've been going through for these almost 50 years now.
I want to give Christy a chance to ask you a question, but I also wanted to point out that your answer there reminded me of one of my favorite slogans that I've seen at the March for Life, the posters that say "Love them both." And It seems like that's the strategy you're really pushing for there. Go ahead, Christy.
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So my first question to our other two candidates, I guess I'll make the same first question to you, is how you're a person of faith, and you kind of talked about your upbringing in a non-denominational church. How do you see that kind of affecting your presidency, and how do you see governing a diverse nation and being kind of the face of a party that, yes, does have mostly Christians, but is theoretically for everyone?
Well, I think that it obviously gives me the ability to see what people who are devout in their faith, to consider their positions, to consider their concerns, because I share many of those myself. But I also, along with my move away from libertarianism toward a more moderate centrist position with the American Solidarity Party, I think I similarly have, while my religious convictions have not changed significantly, I wouldn't say, the realization that we are a country that relies upon people working together, compromise. I'm not looking at all to implement some sort of theocracy, to engage in, let's say, for example, the Roman Catholic Church obviously frowns upon artificial contraception. But I think generally most Catholics who are politicians recognize, and I would too if I were a Roman Catholic politician, that outlawing artificial contraception is not the way to go. That's not going to solve the problems that they see with it. And so similarly, I think that things that are matters of faith, that are matters of religion rather than of policy, should be considered in that light, and we should want religious freedom for ourselves, but also for other people who object to those religious practices, to have the freedom to object to not practice them. So I think that, again, going back to the abortion issue, we can talk about how a lot of people see it as, especially on the pro-choice side, they see it as a religious argument. But we know that, and there are many groups, the secular pro-life, atheists for life, that prove that it's not a religious argument, it's more of a moral, philosophical argument. And so I think as long as we can make a cogent, rational argument in that sense, a practical or moral argument that doesn't rely on religious first principles, that we can, then that's where we need to come from when we talk about how to have a person of faith leading the country without imposing his faith on the country.
Mario, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and ask Joshua a question.
Good afternoon, Joshua.
Definitely.
I have a question, changing a little bit about the focus. You were talking about your change into the American Solidarity Party precisely because we have a care, if you will, or a vision about the poor people who are weak and the least of us. So what is your view about Social Security?
I think that as far as the methods go, I'm haven't done a whole lot of research into what's the optimal way, given our society, our culture, our setup, our current governmental setup, our tax system. What would be the optimal way to do it? But I think that Social Security is a good that the government should provide. I do agree with having it as an entitlement that every citizen can draw upon in the time of need. I think that some of the more recent, in many respects, the proposals that have become more prominent recently, such as universal basic income and things like that, they sound very interesting. I would want to try those out on a limited basis to see which ones are workable, which ones aren't, what sort of things would be practical to do. But again, on the broader topic, I think Social Security is an important thing. I definitely support an income floor of some sort for all American citizens, so that we don't have anyone who is going without just because they are unable to earn enough money to support themselves or their family.
I think it's important to be clear whenever we bring up Social Security that most people are in favor of the concept of Social Security, but when it comes to the particular system of Social Security that we have now, the Social Security Administration, would you be in favor of any changes that occur only occurring for people after those who have currently paid in, or would you change the program even for people who are current participants?
Well, I think that any changes I would advocate would they would be beneficial to people who are current recipients. So I wouldn't advocate cutting Social Security for current recipients, definitely. But I think that I would most likely be in favor of some sort of increase in the contribution rate, most likely of raising or even removing the income cap on the Social Security tax. And so I think that a lot of the stuff that the right talks about when they talk about entitlement reform is, reducing benefits, raising ages, and essentially making it less, making so the government pays out less money. I think I would prefer to have the government bring in more money in order to meet its obligations, and potentially to even increase those obligations if it seems right to do. Let me clarify. I do think that raising the age at which Social Security starts is perhaps something that needs to be considered, especially considering that at the time that the age was set, the life expectancies were much lower, and so from actuarial principles, it was much more sound to have the types of contribution rates that we have now. So I think increasing that age might be. I know it's definitely not a popular political position, but I think it might be the only way that we can make some of the things work. But I am, as I said, in favor of looking at increases in contribution rates as well to close the gap.
I promise that I did not structure this on purpose, James, to ask you to ask a question right after we were talking about Social Security. But do you have a question for our candidate? You're still on mute, James.
Let's see. I don't know why you think I would have any special interest in Social Security, given my tender age. I just want to say, Joshua, I want to add my personal thanks to your joining us. I know it's kind of hard to wait to be third, and everything that you've said is, to my mind, very clear and lucid and engaging in all manner of things. And naturally, I'm delighted that you're a philosophy major. And one of my favorite students forever and ever was a philosophy major and then became an actuary. He'd been tempted by the alternative of becoming a plenipotentiary, but he didn't get that many offers. But I'm going to give you a personal message on the later chapters of his life. I'd like to ask a question that's a tangled knot question. And I don't do it out of orneriness. I do it because I think that so many of the issues we discussed are interlinked. And not only are they interlinked, but so many of the issues we discuss need really to be discussed in the context of an established disorder. I don't think that people would be pursuing the American Solidarity Party if they thought that most things are not so bad and we can proceed as we've been proceeding and probably get things to be pretty doggone good. I think people who join the Solidarity Party think that there's something deeply wrong with the established, what I always call, disorder. Now, that takes me by way of easy and natural transition, as one of my teachers used to say, back to the abortion question. And I want to do this because Matthew always especially appreciates it by way of Aristotle. Aristotle, says that if you're looking for virtue, why don't you look in the mean? Virtus in medio stat. Virtue lies in the mean. And he gives us all sorts of examples of a virtue that really is a virtue, like courage. And then he says, you see, courage lies in the mean. If you lack what's necessary for courage, then you're a coward. And if you have a bogus, inflated kind of courage, then, well, you're foolhardy, right? And courage is somewhere in between. Then he goes on to talk about courage. All right, now, when he talks about adultery, and imagine what we would say about abortion. When he talks about adultery, he says, there's no such thing as adultery at the right time with the right person and in the right place. Adultery is just wrong. So you can't really begin to talk about a virtuous adulterer. All right, now we're back to abortion. There's no such thing as killing an innocent person in the right time and the right place under the right circumstances. It's simply profoundly wrong, and Christians among us would say that's because it's a direct violation of the dignity of an innocent human being. So, when it comes to compromising on abortion, well, it's a little bit like compromising on adultery, except it's a lot worse, really. And I suspect, reality check time, that what you think the left, which is a term I'd like to avoid, will do is in fact wildly unrealistic. I think you've got a little better chance doing something with what we refer to sometimes, and I think mistakenly, as the right. A little better chance. But I think the compromise you propose is a non-starter. I mean, just one more example. Suppose you had this wonderful compromise bill, and part of the compromise bill was, of course, abortion will be allowed in the case of a diagnosis of Down syndrome.
Jim, if you could form that into a question, what are you asking there for Joshua?
Well, I'm asking for Joshua, after that preamble, I'm asking, does he really think the position he has on abortion is realistic? What he proposes as a realistic compromise, it seems to me, is both politically unrealistic and morally flawed.
Well, I think I'd have to say that I do share some of your pessimism regarding the realism of it, but I would say that there isn't anything I can think of that would be more likely to be passed as a compromise. It seems that just about anything else, currently both sides are fairly entrenched in their positions, that the pro-choice side is not interested in any restrictions on abortion, anything to outlaw the procedure in any way, or to reduce the number from the supply side, and that the right is not interested in anything that is going to retain access to abortions, or excuse me, the pro-life side is not interested in anything that's going to retain access to abortions, that is going to, and most of them aren't interested in things that are going to potentially reduce the demand side. So I think that while it is a compromise that is somewhat unrealistic given the entrenched positions of the two sides, I think that a compromise of some sort is necessary rather than attempting to push something through by fiat. I mean, that's what happened when Roe versus Wade was decided, was that the Supreme Court made the decision for the people without giving them a chance to potentially work out some sort of political solution to it. And that has not turned out well.
No more preamble on my part. Just one last compare and contrast. How is your compromise any more promising or grounded than the Missouri compromise?
Well, I think there is a difference there in that, I mean, just practically speaking, if we talk about geography versus policy, the Missouri Compromise, was a failure partly because people wanted to be able to, travel with their slaves and without having to worry about them running away and not being brought back. And then obviously there was moral outrage on both sides. But I think that the Missouri Compromise failed in large part because there was the option of secession. Whereas these days, there isn't such an option. Pretty much isn't a specific region of the country where an overwhelming majority of the people would be willing to secede over this issue if it went against them, because the country is so divided. I mean, even so-called red states. In those states, the surveys show that the percentage of people who are opposed to abortion in all cases across the board is still significantly less than 50%. And then in the blue states, the same thing for people who are support abortion rights throughout pregnancy. In all cases, it's significantly less than 50%. This is an issue that divides us not in a more graduated way than the issue of slavery did, I think.
Yeah, the secession thing is certainly a difference, but quite apart from the political consequences, that slaves should be okay in one state but not okay in another state, and that this is some sort of a compromise, seems to me to show, if anything, historically, that Lincoln, for example, was willing to make compromises in order to maintain the Union, which I don't think we should be making in the first place if innocent lives are at stake. But enough.
Joshua, we've had a question submitted from the various corners of the internet, and one Redditor asked, in light of the rise of populism in both the Democratic and Republican parties, leading to a hardening or a deepening of right and left in both of those parties. A lot of that hardening, a lot of that push for populist appeal, or dare I say a fear-based appeal, is based on the economic stress, particularly faced by the lower middle class that a lot of Americans might consider themselves to be in. Do you agree with that analysis? And if so, what are your plans to address that should you win the presidency?
I do think that populism is a lot of people notice the growing divide, the income inequality that has been increasing, has increased significantly over the past few decades. I do think that is a major issue that needs to be addressed. The fact that we have the so-called 1% or the 0.1% or 9%, whichever dividing line you want to use, we can see the people at the top are making a lot of gains. The people at the bottom or in the middle are staying stagnant, making very slight gains, perhaps. I think that a rethinking of how we set up our political and economic system is the best way, or maybe even the only way, to address that. Because currently the system we have is set up to favor people with money. And so if you already have money, you can make more money more easily. If you don't have money, it's more difficult comparatively to get money in order to provide a better way of life, or to provide for retirement, things like that. So I think that some sort of policies that will reduce that disparity are definitely necessary. As far as it's precisely what that would be, as with a lot of other things, I haven't done in-depth research to come to a firm conclusion. But I think that some of the things we should consider are financial transactions tax, increasing the higher marginal tax brackets, or higher marginal tax rates for the higher brackets, perhaps adding more brackets. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez proposed bringing back 90% as the highest rate. I don't know if I would necessarily go that high, but we have to remember that before the Reagan tax cuts, the highest rate from the end of World War II until about 1980 was somewhere between 70 to 90%, and whereas now we're below 40%. So I think that returning somewhere around where the highest marginal tax rate was when we had gains in productivity going to the middle class, the working class, as well as to the upper class. I think that would be wise. The increase in CEO pay, I think, is another issue. The way that we reward financial speculation is another issue that has to be addressed. So I do think that there is an aspect of the populism that is related to economic concerns from people who are, in the middle quintile or, somewhat lower, seeing that things aren't getting better for them while they're, people up higher are doing very well. I think that is something we do need to address before this, before there are more, before populism becomes more, as you said, it's getting hardened, before it becomes more and more hardened. And then we have, even more entrenched positions on either side that could lead to more significant problems down the road.
There's a economic philosophy that is bandied about and perhaps much admired within the American Solidarity Party, referred to as distributism. And it seems that even amongst the fans of distributism, a lot of people that lean maybe a little right economically think of it as kind of a soft capitalism, and people who lean a little left think of it as kind of a soft socialism. Whereas from the reading I've done, it seems like the goal was to be a clear, distinctive third way. Would you consider yourself a distributist? And if so, what do you think clearly sets it apart from capitalism and socialism?
I would consider myself a distributist. I think that first of all, if the people on the right see it as soft capitalism, people on the left see it as soft socialism, that's perhaps a good thing, in that they might be more willing to accept it. I mean, hopefully as they read more, they'll grow to understand its distinctives. But it might be a way in for those sort of people. The things I think, as I understand it, distributism is the idea that the means of production should be distributed as widely as possible among the public. That citizens should own the ability, the tools, and the resources to make a living for themselves. And I think that's definitely wise. I mean, I think what we've seen is that capitalism it has led, I should say, in our society to a bit of a more oligarchical rather than democratic means of government. So if you have a lot of money, you can buy a lot of airtime, you can get your voice out there, you can get your opinions out there. If you don't, the average citizen has little resources to influence the political system. And then as well, I think socially, it's if a worker has ownership in what he's doing, then he's more likely to be more personally satisfied, to have be happier in his job, which is obviously better for his family, his community. If everyone is more satisfied, that's obviously a plus. And then as well, I think it gives people more freedom to pursue their interests, do what they want to do, rather than feeling as though they're trapped in a job that they don't like in order to earn a wage and pay for the things that they need. So I think that the difference is more that it reins in a lot of the excesses of capitalism. I think you could call it a soft capitalism and a soft socialism in a sense, because it cuts off a lot of the sharp edges, of the sharp corners of capitalism. It says you can't just building a big company that can undercut small companies, like Walmart is often accused of doing, moving in, undercutting mom and pop businesses and then raising prices. That sort of thing would be discouraged by distributism. And then as far as soft socialism, we don't have the public ownership, governmental ownership of the means of production. But the public, in a sense, would own the means of production, in that it would be distributed more broadly rather than being held in the hands of investors, of people who, referring back to the concerns that have in part led to populism, instead of being held in the hands of investors, venture capitalists, people who have lots of money controlling all these companies, these conglomerates, these multinational entities that have market capitalizations of hundreds of billions of dollars. Workers could own a part of that business. They could have that sense of purpose, as well as that pride and ownership that what they're doing is making a difference for the company rather than just being a cog in a machine.
Thank you for that perspective. Christy, if you could go on to ask Joshua another question. Christy, I see you took yourself off mute, but we're not hearing you.
I heard some background sounds. Maybe she's gone chasing a little one.
While we're waiting for Christy to get back with us, Mario, would you ask Joshua a question perhaps on foreign policy?
Well, yes. What is your view on foreign policy in general? Sometimes we have seen now that there is an ambivalence in the American foreign policy because the current president, has promised to have a humble foreign policy, not intervening in different spots in the world. We know what he did in Syria. He said that he would be retreating from Syria, and then he said he's going to stay. So there is an ambivalence, and also the ambivalence regarding the foreign policy with Venezuela. It seems that the United States is intervening to some extent, but they don't want to intervene militarily. So, having said that, what is your view, general view about foreign policy if you were elected to be the president?
Well, I think I would. I think one of the first principles would be that military intervention should be an absolute last resort. I think that sending our troops overseas to fight wars in countries where we don't have to live with the results, as we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, these things can drag on for ages. And even if we decide not to stay and rebuild the nation, obviously the people there have to live with the consequences of what we've done. So I think that military force should be last resort. I think that we should refocus from economic priorities, which are a large part, I think, of what we do, to humanitarian priorities. So I think that when President Obama said there was a bright red line in Syria if they used chemical weapons against their civilians, for example, I think that if we had evidence of such and we attempted to stop such attacks by a government against its own population, I think that would be a defensible position to take, a defensible action to take. But I think that we need to make sure that we're not allowing concerns about national security, as we did in Iraq, to cause us to rush into places where we shouldn't ever have gone. I mean, I think that one of the things that I find is that currently national security is being used as an excuse for just about anything that the administration wants to have done, whether that's drone strikes, whether that's declaring emergencies over the border, or justifying intervention in other countries. And I think that we are fairly secure. I mean, it's not. I just think that those are largely overblown because it's not as though these countries have the ability to actually attack our country successfully. Generally speaking, it's not as though Syria presents a threat to us. It's not as though Yemen presents a threat to the United States directly. So I think that moving away from so I think national defense is something we need to be concerned with. It's something that the government should be providing. But I think that we're already doing a good job of that. I don't think that we need to go overseas and attempt to proactively address problems that may or may not actually come to fruition in our country. So I would definitely be in favor of humanitarian interventions. I think economically speaking, I think we should do the same. I think that, for example, our alliances with Saudi Arabia, our economic alliance with China, based on those countries' awful human rights records, should not be the case. We should not have those situations in place, those favorable agreements with them. I find that to be one of the most disappointing things about both Democratic and Republican administrations is the willingness to overlook, murders, tortures, imprisonments that we would consider completely unjustified because it makes us money or because it makes us more comfortable or whatever it might be.
Let me follow up with that and ask, given our current treaty obligations and our current commitments in countries where we are already militarily active, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, what is the, without having consulted your highly paid advisors and or the Joint Chief of Staff yet, what is your opinion on the appropriate way to move forward in those countries?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that. I think that this, it's a situation, as you mentioned, Afghanistan and Iraq are just quagmires that we have found ourselves unable to extricate ourselves from. And I think that there aren't any good solutions, that we need to find the neutral or least bad solutions, I suppose. And what that would be, it's not clear to me. I mean, I think that the governance of those countries is just something that we are not really equipped to handle. So I don't know that I have a good answer. I would have to, if I became president, I would have to rely upon my highly paid advisors and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to give me some good information and good analysis to come up with options for that.
As any good president would, I would hope. I believe we have Christy back. If you would like to go ahead and ask a question, Christy.
I hope so. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. To switch back kind of into domestic policy, I guess, one of the major kind of contentions we've had in the party in the past has been the debate over LGBT issues. Where do you stand on that? What are your kind of thoughts about if the party should change its policy or should change our kind of position or not? Things like that.
Well, I think it's somewhat similar to what I was saying earlier about to the question about being a person of faith in a position of power and how that should interact with policy. I think that LGBT people deserve respect of all of the human rights that they have, that they share with everyone else. So I think that things that are hate crimes against them, discrimination against them in employment, things like that is intolerable. It's something that we should not be allowing. The question, I think, getting to what you're talking about within the party is how do we balance religious liberties with that? And I think that is a difficult question. It's going to be, I think, in the next decade or so, one of the major issues in social issues in our country is how we handle, the florists, the bakers, etc. And my position on that is that so it's twofold, sort of, I suppose. So first is that we should not discriminate against people based simply upon sexual orientation or which pronouns they prefer. And so I should not be allowed to, if I work for a company privately, but say I took clients on as an actuary, or maybe I became a financial advisor, and someone comes to me and says, I'm interested in planning for my retirement, and indicates by the conversation that she's gay. I shouldn't be able to say, well, I'm not a fan of gay people, so not going to be able to help you. Sorry. So that's the sort of discrimination I think is similar to what Black people experienced, and occasionally still do, but it's definitely less than now. But what Black people experienced, and that was attempted to be addressed by the Civil Rights Act of 1968, is just being discriminated against because of who you are, because of the type of person that you are. So I am not a fan of that. However, will say I think that there is a distinction that is often lost and can be difficult to make, but that's lost between orientation and action. So, for example, if for example, some hotels used to not rent rooms to unmarried people, right? And so because of their assumption, I suppose, as to what those rooms might be used for. To an unmarried couple, not to people who just weren't married, but to an unmarried couple, they wouldn't rent a single room. And so I think that sort of thing, we're talking about action, that if it's the for those hotels, that they don't want to, I couldn't think of the word. They don't want to sort of assist in this immoral act, what they see as an immoral act. I don't think that we should necessarily prevent them from doing so. And so I think we could potentially allow civil liberties allow religious exceptions in that case. If you say don't want to participate in, for example, the florist cases we hear about, or the baking cases, if you don't want to create a wedding cake for this event that you don't agree with, then I think we should allow exceptions for that, assuming that there are other options. I think that if you, for example, there is a specialized service that you provide and you're the only person in the area who can provide it, or if there essentially aren't any realistic alternatives, I think we might have to consider that separately. But if you're a baker and there's another baker a mile away, another baker 2 miles away, I think that in that situation, the imposition on the gay couple would not be as significant, and so we could consider the conscience of the baker to allow him to decline to participate in that event.
Christy, do you have any follow-up questions to that?
Sure. So one of the kind of questions that have come up among some of the more progressive members of the party, I guess, is about the basic dignity of the LGBT person in terms of conversion therapy. That's something that's kind of controversial. Some people are really pro it. I'm personally pretty against it. I just want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I'm not certain as to, I think I've heard conflicting definitions of conversion therapy, but what I would say is that if the patient is an adult and wishes to attempt to change his or her sexual orientation, I don't know if that's possible, but if he wishes to and finds a therapist who is willing to attempt to do so, I don't see any reason to restrict that type of association or type of business relationship. I do think that when it comes to children, I would, especially if there is research showing that it's harmful, as I understand there is, I would be very hesitant to allow therapists to treat children in that way. But I think as long as the patient is an adult and is choosing to do so, I don't think it should be outlawed in that case.
Thank you. James, do you have another question for the candidate?
Why, of course. I'm very appreciative of your comments. I'm especially appreciative of what you had to say about human rights violations in China and how they can't be ignored and how they characteristically are ignored. The ones that we are so well aware of in Saudi Arabia are not so often ignored, but they're certainly ignored by the current administration, and I think that's reprehensible. With regard to considerations bearing on social policy and homosexual persons, there surely is. I mean, of course, a religious dimension to it. But there's a natural law argument against homosexual acts that I think needs to be addressed. I don't think that ever in any Solidarity Party discussion or forum has there been any sustained discussion about the nature and significance and direction of human sexuality, and that simply is going to have to be done. But what I'd like you to address now, and I think this is very realistic in the sense that you, of course, won't be president, and it's this: the contribution that the American Solidarity Party, I think, can make very realistically to the current discussions is to insist on using language as it ought to be used. And we have a historical parallel here. No time has been more disordered than the time in which George Orwell wrote. And one of his lasting contributions is something called the politics of the English language. And I think that on both the so-called right and the so-called left, there's an undeniable recognition that George Orwell was blowing whistles that needed to be blown. So I think in our case, we very often fall into conservative liberal, reactionary progressive, left right, and a lot of blather about the American people. Do you see ways that we as a party could call for the coherent and honest use of the English language in ways that we haven't so far?
Well, I'm not sure if I can say that we haven't so far in this way, but I think perhaps the most important way, and this was reiterated to me in a post by, I believe, Robert P. George on the Facebook a few weeks ago, is how we talk about abortion. And so in that case, we, the media, people on the pro-choice side, and occasionally people on the pro-life side will use words to sort of obscure the issue of what is actually happening in abortion. They'll talk about terminating the pregnancy, talk about dilation and extraction, but the undeniable fact. We can talk about whether the unborn child is a human person in the moral sense is something that is up for debate. I happen to believe it is, but that's something that we can discuss and debate. It's not an objective fact necessarily. We can, however, agree if we understand the science of it, we understand fetal development and embryology, that every time an abortion occurs, an unborn human being is killed. And that's the sort of thing I think that we should insist upon being used by pro-choice people, by media outlets, if we can, as much as we can, is to acknowledge the reality of what happens in abortion, not just a pregnancy is terminated, and that's a very sanitized description of what happens. But I do think also, just to go to the other side, I think we can go too far, especially given the context in which we're having these discussions. I think a lot of the time there's some groups which will use graphic imagery of fetal remains to make their point. And I think that there is a place for that. I don't know that it's necessarily in public on a street corner, but I think those images should definitely be accessible for those who want to learn the facts, to understand the reality of what's happening. But I think that pushing those disturbing images front and center can cause people on the other side, for the pro-choice people, as well as even people who are undecided on the issue, cause them to harden in their position or to move toward the pro-choice side, just because they see this as an unnecessarily graphic and disturbing portrayal.
Just to introduce one more example, here in California, assisted suicide is covered under health care.
Yes, I think that's a good point as well. I think a lot of these life issues are we use words to cover up what we're doing. And I think assisted suicide is, in a sense, it's a fairly accurate description, right? We have someone who's attempting to kill himself and is being assisted by another person. But in practice, I think it turns out often to be, ableism in action. Because a lot of the people who are availing themselves of these assisted suicide laws are disabled in one way or another, or they're in ill health. And rather than attempting to treat them, to care for them humanely, they are often urged, or even maybe gently, sometimes less gently other times, to consider taking the so-called easy way out and just ending things, as it were. I think that's another way that we can
and one last one, Joshua. None of the major parties are going to do anything really about nuclear deterrence, but it's really not nuclear deterrence. It's really a form of terrorism. It's using the threat of mass destruction in order to defend certain political positions. And that seems to be yet another case. We're not going to win, and you're not going to be president, but I would love us to call a spade when it comes to nuclear terrorism, is what gets sanitized as nuclear deterrence.
Well, I think that on that issue, we should drastically reduce the size of our nuclear arsenal. I'm saying we have thousands of missiles. We don't need more than probably a couple hundred to do what we are claiming that we will do. Even if we shouldn't be doing it, we don't need. It's complete overkill to have the artillery that we have in our nuclear arsenal. I would say, however, I do think that there is a case to be made for very limited nuclear deterrence, in which if you say, as long as you're, and this is something that I think that the government is not good at, if you're absolutely clear that we will never fire these missiles in any case, unless similar missiles are being fired upon us. And I haven't said it. I don't think that we should, even if we were attacked nuclearly or by Russia or by China or by another country, I don't think we should retaliate, because I think that would just mean greater loss of life. And obviously, we wouldn't win that war. No one would win that war. It would be a terrible thing for humanity.
Yeah, again and again, we've refused to take a no first use position, publicly refused to take a no first use position. But enough. I think there's obvious crucial issues in which if people would just tell the bloomin' truth, we could think better.
We only have a few minutes left in the show, and I definitely want to give Joshua the chance to let people know how to connect with him. How can they find out what you've published or thought in the past? Do you have a website that you can refer them to? And don't forget to actually ask people to vote for you.
I have not published much in the past. I have a blog with a few essays on it. I've probably published about one every 2 years on varied topics. So not much there. I think if you want to know what I think, the best way to do that is to follow me on Facebook. It's not a public page, since I'm just a regular guy. But my name is Joshua Perkins. If you search for Joshua Perkins, I think if you search for Houston, probably that'll probably help. So, but if you can find my page on Facebook, then all my posts are public. I post, I don't know, probably every week or two at least, on issues that I find compelling, whether that be, the pro-life issue, of course, whether that be racial reconciliation, whether that be how we treat our prisoners and inmates, all sorts of things, anything that catches my fancy, you can find on there. But it's a good way, I think, to, if you want to get an idea of my positions on issues that we haven't touched on in this interview, a good way to do is to scroll through my timeline there, and you can get a feel, I think, for where I come down on things that aren't in the party platform. And yes, I would be happy to receive your vote if you find that my positions, that my planned way of doing things appeals to you. I'd be happy to get your vote in the convention, and then if I manage to get the nomination in the general election.
We'll be sure to include any links, like to your Facebook page, that you would like us to in the promotional materials. Jim, would you close us out?
Yes. Lord God, we need to remember how much we need your mercy and how much we have your mercy. Give us your light. Help us to walk in your light. And we ask you, Lord Jesus, come again, come in glory. Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.